Tell you something that most people get completely wrong when they think about military power. They assume that the strongest army always wins. That the country with the biggest budget, the most advanced weapons, the most aircraft carriers, that country will always come out on top. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how wars actually work. The United States has the most powerful military in the history of human civilization. I am not exaggerating when I say that. The budget alone is larger than the next 10 countries combined. So let me tell you something that most people get completely wrong when they think about military power. They assume that the strongest army always wins. That the country with the biggest budget, the most advanced weapons, the most aircraft carriers, that country will always come out on top. And on the surface, that logic makes total sense. Why wouldn't it? But here's where it gets interesting. And honestly, this idea flipped my entire understanding of how wars actually work. The United States has the most powerful military in the history of human civilization. I am not exaggerating when I say that. The budget alone is larger than the next 10 countries combined. The technology is generations ahead of most rivals. The global network of bases, the satellite intelligence systems, the nuclear arsenal, the carrier strike groups, it is genuinely unlike anything the world has ever seen before. If you put America in a direct conventional war against almost any other nation on earth, it is not even a close contest. It will be over very quickly. And yet, Iran is still standing. Iran has been under enormous pressure from Washington for decades. Sanctions, threats, proxy conflicts, assassinations of top military figures. And still, the Iranian government operates. Still, the Iranian military builds and develops. Still, Tehran refuses to simply collapse the way Washington would prefer. How does that happen? How does a country with a fraction of the military budget, far older equipment, and no nuclear deterrent manage to survive in a permanent standoff with the most powerful nation in history? The answer is that Iran is not trying to win the way America defines winning. Iran is playing an entirely different game. And once you understand that distinction, everything about their strategy starts to make sense. Think about it this way. Imagine two people in a fight. One person is a professional heavyweight boxer, big, strong, fast, trained for years. The other person is smaller, lighter, far less powerful in a direct confrontation. If they fight in a boxing ring, following boxing rules, the smaller person loses every single time. It is not even close. But now imagine the fight moves out of the ring, into a dark alley, into a crowded market, into a building the smaller person has lived in for 20 years and knows like the back of their hand. Suddenly the rules change. Suddenly the boxer's power and training become less relevant. And suddenly the person who knows every corner of that environment has a real advantage. That is the concept of asymmetrical warfare. And it is not a new idea. Weaker powers have been using it against empires for thousands of years. The idea is simple. You do not fight on the stronger power's terms. You reshape the battlefield until their strengths become liabilities. And here is something that makes this more than just theory. In 2002, the United States military actually ran a massive simulation to test exactly this scenario. They called it Millennium Challenge 2002. It was one of the largest war games ever conducted. The whole point was to simulate a conflict between American forces and a Middle Eastern adversary that operated a lot like Iran. They divided into two teams. Blue team was America, red team was the adversary. And in the early stages of the simulation, the red team commander did something that completely blindsided the Pentagon. Instead of meeting the American naval force directly, he used swarming tactics, small, fast boats, unconventional missile attacks, irregular communication methods that the Americans could not easily track or jam, surprise, speed, chaos. Within hours, the simulation showed that a massive portion of the American fleet had been destroyed, thousands of simulated casualties, billions in simulated losses. The most powerful navy in the world had been defeated by an opponent who refused to play by conventional rules. Now here's where the story gets even more revealing. The Americans restarted the exercise, but this time they changed the rules. They told the Red Team commander he was no longer allowed to use those asymmetrical tactics. He had to fight in a more traditional, predictable way. And when the game resumed under those conditions, America won easily. So what does that tell us? It tells us that American military dominance is real and overwhelming, but only when the war is fought on American terms. The moment an adversary refuses to accept those terms, the entire equation shifts. Iran has studied this. Iran has studied Vietnam, where America had overwhelming superiority in technology and firepower and still could not convert that into a decisive victory because the Vietnamese refused to fight the expected way. Iran has studied Afghanistan, where the most sophisticated military machine in history spent 20 years in a conflict it could not resolve against fighters using basic weapons and a deep knowledge of local terrain. Iran has studied every case where a powerful empire ran into the limits of raw military force. And from all of that study, Iran has developed what you might call a strategic matrix, a framework where every action, every alliance, every military investment, every diplomatic move must serve multiple purposes at the same time. Because here's the reality. Iran cannot afford to waste resources. If you are a smaller power facing a superpower, every single move has to be efficient. You cannot make gestures. You cannot spend political capital on actions that only serve one purpose. Everything has to work on at least 2 or 3 levels simultaneously. So what are those levels? What is Iran actually trying to achieve with this matrix? The first thing is internal cohesion. If a conflict begins, if bombs start falling or American ships enter the Gulf in an aggressive posture, Iran needs its population to unite rather than fracture. And this matters enormously. One of the ways that outside powers break regimes is by turning the population against its own government during a crisis. If the Iranian people believe they are under attack, survival instinct kicks in. National identity becomes the dominant force. The government becomes harder to destabilize from within. So every action Iran takes is partly designed to reinforce the idea that this is a fight for survival, not a fight between competing political systems. The second level is alliance building. Iran cannot stand alone. No country can. And so for decades, Iran has been cultivating relationships across the region and beyond. Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, various militia networks in Iraq and Syria, relationships with Russia and China at the diplomatic level. These are not random. Each relationship is a node in the network designed to complicate American calculations. If attacking Iran means triggering responses across multiple countries simultaneously, the cost of that attack increases dramatically. Suddenly, Washington is not just thinking about one conflict, it is managing a region on fire. The third level is the battle for global opinion. This is one the United States often underestimates, and Iran takes very seriously. Wars in the modern era are not only won on battlefields. They are won or lost in the court of international public opinion, at the United Nations, in the media, in the streets of cities around the world where people protest or support. If Iran can consistently frame any conflict as a case of a smaller country defending itself against imperial aggression, the political cost for Washington goes up. Congressional support becomes harder to maintain. Allied countries become reluctant to participate. The moral narrative matters. And the fourth level is strategic attrition. Not destroying America, not humiliating America in some single dramatic confrontation, but exhausting America, slowly raising the cost of engagement over time, making the calculation in Washington shift from "we can win this" to "is this worth it?" Economic disruption through pressure on oil shipping routes. Psychological pressure through the threat of missile attacks on American bases in the region. The constant low-level friction that drains resources, attention, and political will. Now here is the key insight. This entire strategy depends on one concept more than any other, and that concept is patience. America is a democracy. American presidents face elections every 4 years. Public opinion shifts. Media cycles move fast. Budgets are debated annually. The political system creates pressure for quick results. Voters do not want to hear that a conflict might take a decade to resolve. Iran is playing on a completely different timescale. The Iranian strategic establishment thinks in terms of decades. They have been developing this approach since the revolution in 1979. They are not looking for a quick win. They are looking for a situation where America eventually decides the cost of continued pressure is too high, where Washington calculates that the resources being spent to maintain maximum pressure on Iran could be better used elsewhere, where the political will in the United States simply runs out. And if you look at history, that is actually how many asymmetrical conflicts end. Not with the weaker side winning a decisive battle, but with the stronger side exhausting itself and withdrawing. There is another factor that makes the Iranian matrix so unsettling to analysts in Washington, and that is the economic asymmetry of modern weapons systems. American aircraft carriers cost $5 billion to build. The aircraft that fly off them cost hundreds of millions each. The systems that protect those carriers are enormously expensive. And Iran has spent years developing relatively cheap drones, missiles, and fast boat swarms that can threaten those assets. Not with certainty, not reliably, but enough to force America to spend enormous resources on defensive systems to protect enormously expensive hardware from relatively inexpensive threats. When the cost of defending something is much higher than the cost of threatening it, the mathematics of warfare start to shift. The stronger power starts bleeding money in ways that are difficult to sustain politically over long periods.
And this is the endgame Iran is aiming at. Not a dramatic military victory, but a strategic environment where the cost of confronting Iran consistently outweighs the benefit, where Washington ultimately concludes that some form of accommodation is preferable to permanent, draining conflict. The most important thing to understand about all of this is the timing. The strategy does not begin when the shooting starts. It begins years before. Every alliance built, every missile developed, every diplomatic relationship cultivated, every narrative crafted for international audiences, all of it is preparation. By the time any actual conflict becomes visible to the world, the strategic environment has already been shaped over years or even decades. That is why analysts who look only at the balance of conventional military forces are missing the point entirely. Raw military power matters. It matters enormously. But it does not operate in a vacuum. It operates inside a strategic environment that has been built piece by piece over a very long time. And in that environment, survival is victory. Endurance is winning. If Iran is still standing, still functioning, still exerting influence across the region 5 years or 10 years or 20 years from now, that is the win. That was always the win. The question was never whether Iran could defeat America. The question was always whether Iran could survive America. And so far, against all of the pressure that has been applied, the answer has been yes. That is what makes this strategy so genuinely fascinating and so genuinely frightening to the people in Washington whose job it is to think about these things.